What disturbing thing did you learn about someone only after their death? Story 1. I received a phone call from my late husband's girlfriend on the day of his funeral. She was calling his cell phone, which I had kept turned off while he was in the hospital. She told me that my husband had been paying her rent for the last year. At the same time, the bank had recently foreclosed on our house. I had no idea he had been unfaithful to me, but she knew all about me. Story 2. Something similar happened to my mom. My dad had a mistress for whom he paid all the bills, including her college expenses. She was probably around 30 or 35 years old, and he was 44 when he died. The college part really hurt my mom because she had always wanted to go herself, but there was never money. Anyway, the woman even had the nerve to show up at his funeral. She did not stay long, but she went by the casket to say goodbye. My mom found out about their relationship before his passing, but he had tried to make amends, telling her he and the woman were finished, and my mom stayed because of her 3 kids. My dad would often threaten to hurt me, my siblings, my mom, and then himself if she left. We had caught him cheating long before that as well. My mom went through hell with him. I do not really miss him at all, and I am glad I did not grow into an adult with him in my life. Still, because of everything, I matured a lot earlier than most kids. I was 11 when he died. My mom endured so much because of him, and I do not know how she managed. She is a true hero. Story 3. My dad had sole control over all family finances. We were not living in poverty by any means, but he constantly stressed my mom out about bills and sudden expenses by claiming we were tight on money, running out of money, or that he was not making as much at the moment. He would even go as far as saying we could lose the house, lose the cars, or that he might lose his job soon, or that we might not be able to pay the water, electric, or phone bills. In reality, he had a large amount of money secretly stashed away in a separate bank account and was living lavishly on his so-called business trips. There was never any danger to our house, possessions, or way of life. He made up those stories and started those arguments for the sick pleasure of causing my mom stress and making himself feel powerful, and maybe for the thrill of having a secret. Who knows for sure? Later, during their divorce, I found out the truth by digging through his belongings. My mom never told me any of this and did not want me to look, but I discovered it all on my own. My mom was not a stay-at-home mom either. She worked hard to help provide for us, while he spent his time playing games online and secretly making money by siphoning from his best friend's company. Story 4. I had a brother who suffered from paranoid delusions, believing that agencies like the FBI and CIA were following him and spying on his apartment. My brothers and I tried to get him help, but he refused every time. After a few years, it seemed to get better. He stopped mentioning it, and we thought it had passed. After he died, we found his journal, and it was horrifying. Right up until the night he died, he described all of the torment he believed he was experiencing. Disturbing details that are difficult even to mention. It was incredibly painful to realize the life he was living inside his mind. While on the outside, he appeared relatively normal. In his writing, he believed that some type of focused energy beam was being used to torture him, targeting different parts of his body at different times. Every noise an appliance made became proof of electronic surveillance. Every bump on the wall or sound from a neighbor was a message from either bad agents or good agents. It was deeply disturbing to read. Story 5. I went through a nasty breakup with my oldest child's mom that lasted several years. We were never married, and she acted irrationally, telling the hospital she did not know our child's father just so she could have leverage over me. Years later, after several investigations into child abuse, she lost custody. Over the next several years, we kept receiving oddly specific complaints about things going on in my house involving my daughter and her stepmom. Small details like matching clothes or how we handled timeouts. My mom passed away 2 years ago, and when we switched her Facebook to memorial mode, I discovered that she had been speaking badly about me for years to my ex. She had essentially been spying on me for her and twisting information. I guess it was because she felt sorry for a mother who lost her child, but it was still a betrayal. It has been 2 years, and I still refuse to visit her grave with my siblings and have not shed a tear for her since. Story 6. Here's the deal. My mom was raised by her mother, who is now 92, and her stepfather, who abused her. Where was her dad? My grandmother told her he had died when she was 11, which would have been around 1961. Flash forward to 2015, when my sister was researching our genealogy, and she found out that not only had my biological grandfather not died in 1961, but he had actually died in 2005. He had gone on to have 5 more daughters, one of whom he even gave the same name as my mom. So my mom was cheated out of a relationship with her real dad because of the lies of her mother, who moved and remained hidden from her ex. Later, my grandmother moved from Virginia to Texas to stay in a nursing home and continued making my mom and dad's life miserable. We went to visit one weekend, and she came over for dinner. I confronted her, telling her we had figured out she had been lying for 50 years, and she had the nerve to act offended. My dad told her to stop immediately. Story 7. When my great-grandmother passed away last year, we found a hidden photo album in her closet that was full of pictures from World War II. We are not certain because she never spoke about it, but from the photos it appeared that my great-grandfather was part of the Nazi Party and that they lived quite a lavish life during the war. It caused tension in the family, but we still do not know the exact truth. We do know that my great-grandfather was captured in France and that after the war ended, they came to Canada. Neither of them ever talked about the details. Later, my mom and I tried searching his name online, although we suspect he changed it after immigrating. We found records of his brother, who died in battle, but none of him. Their last name was very common, which made things harder. Even my grandmother, who was their only child, does not know much about her parents' life before Canada. She was around 4 or 5 years old when they moved, and when she asked questions, she was always told, "Never mind." As someone who loves history, I found it fascinating. For all we know, they could have been forced into joining, though my mom feels they truly supported the Nazi Party based on their personalities and the occasional comments they made. Story 8. Not only did my grandfather physically, emotionally, and socially abuse me, but he also did the same to my mother and 2 aunts. My grandmother knew the entire time and had been confronted about it, yet she did nothing. I still cannot look at her the same way. He is dead now, but the memories remain, and she still refuses to talk about it. I was raised by my grandparents because my mother was absent from my life. The abuse started when I was around 5 years old. He always threatened to hurt or get rid of me if I told anyone, and as a child, that fear kept me silent. From the age of 5 until about 10, I endured abuse daily while my grandmother worked, since he was on disability and home all day. I remember once trying to tell my grandmother that he was hurting me, but I could not find the words to explain. She dismissed me, saying it must have been a dream or my imagination, because if it were real, I would be covered in bruises. I never tried telling her again. Years later, after he died, I found letters in his estate from my youngest aunt confronting him about the pain he had caused. That is how I learned about what my mother and aunts had suffered too. I have not talked to any of them about it, afraid of bringing back more pain, but I want some kind of closure. As a mother now, I cannot imagine ignoring something like that if my child came to me. Writing this for the first time in 25 years has strangely made me feel better. I finally understand that it was not my fault and that I will not be judged for sharing my experience. Story 9. My cousin, only a few months older than me and in her mid-30s, died tragically in very unexpected circumstances. We were not extremely close, but it was still a shock and devastated her immediate family. About 6 months after her death, I found out that my brother, who was a police officer, had once pulled her over without knowing it was her. As per the law where we live, he gave her a mandatory breath test for alcohol, and she was well over the limit, which resulted in drink driving charges about a year before she died. Because her family always portrayed themselves as perfect and refused to accept the possibility of alcoholism, they accused my brother of fabricating the result due to a supposed family grudge. They even tried to have him charged with misconduct and fired, which made his life miserable for a while, though it was unsuccessful. Her family does not know I am aware of this, and I feel conflicted between wanting to tell them how unfair they were and recognizing the pain they are already going through after her death, not wanting to add more to it. Story 10. One of my cousins was murdered when I was 12 years old. At the time, my parents told me it was a random gang initiation and that he had been stabbed while walking home from work one night. A few years later, they revealed the truth. My cousin had been married but was on his way to see his mistress when he was killed, and the suspected killer was the mistress's boyfriend at the time. The murder happened in the Philippines, and the police never pursued the case seriously, but my family strongly believes the boyfriend was responsible. He even attended the funeral. Knowing the truth did not change my love for my cousin or the good memories I have of him, but it deeply saddened me because his death felt avoidable. At first, I thought it was simply a matter of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, which in some ways was easier to accept. On the bright side, he left behind two children, one with his wife and one with his mistress, who have a sibling relationship with each other, which is heartwarming to see. Story 11. My Nana always gave me an uneasy feeling when I was around her. I never adored her, but I thought she was just a regular old lady until after her death. That was when my mom confessed the truth. Nana had been a religious zealot, so extreme that she would scream at my mom for hours for things as small as wearing fitted jeans, claiming she was inviting the devil. She would even take my mom and her brother into the backyard and force them to beat each other with sticks. When my mom's brother later died in a car accident, Nana mocked him at the funeral, saying he deserved it because he had drunk alcohol underage, insisting he was burning in hell and that it was good riddance. She was cruel. My mom eventually ran away at 18. Nana only seemed to calm down once my mom had children because she wanted grandchildren. And my mom, being forgiving, allowed her back into her life on the condition that she never treated us the way she had treated her. My mom may have forgiven her, but I never did. I know she never truly changed inside, and looking back, I see how much her abuse shaped my mother's life and mental health, leaving scars she never fully recovered from. I wish I could talk to my mom now, as an adult, about trauma and healing, but it is too late for that. Story 12. My aunt died. To me, she was a saint. I met her when I was 7 years old, and she had already known my mom for about 2 years. Only later did I find out she had been speaking badly about my mom behind her back and was two-faced throughout most of their friendship. She even talked about my mom to her own blood relatives. Nearly 20 years of friendship, through cancer, poverty, raising kids, and being by her side on her deathbed. And the whole time, she was betraying her. I attended the funeral, and the following week, everyone suddenly had something to say about how cruel she really was. They claimed they kept quiet out of respect for my mom, but the truth is they sat by while my aunt mocked her and never defended her. That is what I cannot understand. They were my mom's relatives, yet they laughed and snickered at her expense, taking money and time from her while pretending to care. They righteously claimed they stayed quiet to protect her, when in reality they let her best friend betray her. Everyone seemed to be scheming against my mom while she was just trying to be kind. We have confronted her about this over the years, and she has gotten better at setting boundaries. But I still cannot understand how people could take pleasure in her pain. Now I look at all of them the same way. No one is special. I do not trust anyone anymore, and none of them will be welcome at my mom's funeral. I do not want their crocodile tears or their dramatic antics, like the ones I witnessed at my aunt's open casket. Story 13. A paternal great-uncle of mine, whom I will call A, died when I was 5 years old. It was a closed casket funeral, and when I asked why, my mom told me it was because he had been shot. Years later, when I was a teenager, I learned the truth. A had taken his own life outside a bar one night because he believed the police were after him. The gun was never recovered by the authorities. That bar happened to be owned by my maternal aunt's ex-husband, Jay. When I was 22, I learned even more. A's brother B was accused of possessing child pornography and abusing a minor. I was shocked, but my mom seemed almost unsurprised. She told me that she and other family members had long suspected that A and B were similar in disturbing ways. A had abused one of his niece's friends, and when he learned the police were going to arrest him, he ended his life. After calling the police, Jay also called my dad to let him know what had happened. There was some conversation about the gun because Jay stole it from the crime scene and later met my dad to hand it over. It was a World War II pistol that had belonged to my great-grandfather, and Jay took it so it would stay in the family rather than being locked away as evidence. As for B, he is now in prison, where he will remain for life. Story 14. I had a great-uncle I did not even know existed, and my mom barely remembered him. One day my grandma suddenly said, "My brother died. I'm going to his funeral up in Iowa. And we were all upset thinking Uncle B had passed. Then she clarified, oh no, the other one, Uncle M. Other one? Uncle who? Apparently she had been no contact with him for most of her adult life because he had abused her and her sister when they were children, which explained why she cut him off. From his belongings, we ended up with a curved television, but since no one had space for it, it went to a family friend instead. On a lighter note, my great-grandpa on my dad's side passed away in 2015 from an aneurysm. After the funeral, when everyone gathered at home, we discovered something unexpected. He had been very tech-savvy, which made sense since he had worked with computers starting in the Korean War, but we did not realize how advanced he was. He had passwords for everything, often inspired by poems he loved. While searching for account details, we stumbled upon 5 boxes of Cadbury eggs and 2 gallon-sized bags filled with hard caramels hidden in a cabinet above his computer. Everyone knew Grandpapa had a sweet tooth, but even his wife had no idea about such a stash. The man was thin, yet he had been secretly hoarding candy. With about 20 cousins and siblings dividing it up, needless to say, there was nothing left by the time everyone went home. Story 15. My grandfather never spoke much about his teenage years. All he ever told me was that he grew up on the island of Java in the 1940s, even though he was of German-Dutch origin. When he passed, he left me an autobiography he had written to be read after his death. I learned that my great-grandfather, whom I was named after, had been a radio engineer for the Dutch government, building long-range radio stations over 1,000 kilometers. My grandfather and his siblings were attending a boarding school in the Black Forest in Bavaria when their parents visited and discovered that he had been forced into the Hitler Youth. They quickly took the children and moved to Java. Life was stable until the Japanese invaded. Their reconnaissance revealed my great-grandfather's skills as a radio engineer, so Japanese forces went straight to their cottage and took the family hostage, forcing him to build radio stations for their military campaigns. At 16, my grandfather was separated from his family and placed in 6 different prison camps throughout the war. By 1945, at the end of the war, he was in a camp outside Kyoto. He was 22 years old, 6 feet 3 inches tall, and weighed only 83 pounds. When Japan surrendered, the army was ordered to yield to the nearest high-ranking Westerner. Since he was the oldest prisoner in the camp, my grandfather became responsible for the camp and its 300 troops for 3 days until U.S. Marines arrived. He wrote that he had been planning to travel into Kyoto after living nearby for over a year, but the Marines arrived just 1 day before he was set to go. He was taken to the USS Missouri to witness the signing of the peace treaty and later transferred to a U.S. Naval hospital in the Philippines to recover. There, he developed a lifelong love of pancakes because that was what they fed him to help him gain weight again. Until I read his memoir, I had no idea about this part of his life. He left me many other items as well, since I was his only male grandchild. A detailed family tree tracing our history back to 1276, a ball cap from the USS Missouri, a U.S. Marine-issued field jacket given to him for warmth, and my personal favorite, the original pamphlet that had been dropped over his prison camp in 1945, announcing the end of the war and promising liberation by the Marines. Story 16. My grandfather, my mom's stepdad, died when I was around 12 or 13. He always had a stock of Hot Wheels cars so he could give me one every time I visited. He would play Legos with me, we would drink root beer together, and listen to Shania Twain. The only story I ever really heard from my mom was how he and my grandmother met after her biological dad had died in a molasses accident. When I was about 12 or 13, after his death, I was listening to a Nirvana song when my mom came in panicking. I asked her what was wrong, and she finally told me the truth about him. He had been the son of a woman in prostitution and was fathered by one of her clients. They lived in one room with a burnt sheet hung between him and his mother while she worked. He was baptized into the Ku Klux Klan and grew up to be a coal mining alcoholic, cruel to nearly everyone in town. He beat my mom, her sister, and brother. He would hold loaded guns to their heads and tell them that if the bullet did not cost him a nickel, he would shoot them. He harmed my mom and my female cousin, and he beat my 2 male cousins because he hated their father the most. His alcoholism even turned his hair a yellow color instead of white. Despite all this, he had been a kind grandfather to me, and I never understood why the rest of the family feared him so much. Story 17. My grandma always told me that her youngest brother had died in the army at 18. After she passed away a few years ago, I started looking up relatives on a Find a Grave website because our family is so scattered and fractured. That was when I discovered that her brother had not died young at all. He had lived for decades in a nearby town. There is no one left in my family I trust to tell me the truth. But I remember once overhearing her confess that she had been assaulted as a young woman. I cannot shake the feeling that her own brother may have been responsible, and that is why she treated him as though he were dead. If that was true, I would not blame her. She must have had a powerful reason to cut him out of our lives completely. Out of respect for her, I never tried to contact his wife, children, or other relatives. I figure she did what she needed to do, and I want to honor her choice. Story 18. I was at my uncle's funeral in Germany. To give context, my dad was born in 1934 and was 29 years older than my mother. My uncles were also born around that time, so they all lived through Hitler's rule. No one in the family likes to talk much about those years, so I barely know any first-hand stories. At the funeral, the priest spoke about my uncle's life. One part of his story chilled me. He described how my uncle had once been forced by Nazi soldiers to stand facing a wall, with his back to them, along with several other men. They were told they were about to be executed, which was apparently a common intimidation tactic. The soldiers then fired shots into the air, making them all believe for a moment that they had been killed. Hearing that at his funeral was deeply disturbing, and I cannot stop thinking about how terrifying that experience must have been. Story 19. I recently learned that my grandfather did not treat my grandmother well. He died about 18 years ago, and she passed about 7 years ago. In a conversation with my dad, I found out that my grandfather always insulted and belittled my grandmother and my aunt. He had wanted a son, but their first child was a daughter, and when their second child, a boy, was stillborn, he unfairly blamed my grandmother. He controlled all of their money and was emotionally abusive. Growing up, I just remember him as grouchy, and I assumed my grandmother was grouchy too, so I thought that was just their way. I was about 13 when he died. My dad assured me he was never physically abusive, but the emotional damage was real, and it still bothers me today. I am told that I take after my other grandfather, who was the opposite, always ready to help anyone, and sadly he died before I was born. Story 20. A few years ago, my grandfather passed away, followed shortly after by my dad. In trying to reconnect with that side of the family, my cousin and I began reaching out. She was my father's sister's daughter. We attended a family reunion in another state and met some of our grandfather's cousins and aunts. I shared what I knew, that my grandfather had been an abusive alcoholic who mistreated his daughters. He had even once shot through his own front door to attack his wife after she threw him out. As a child, my dad had to climb out of a window to get help. According to relatives, my grandfather eventually married again in the 1960s and then vanished from their lives. But when I shared the stories I knew, one male cousin became visibly upset and said something like, "He was a good man, and we don't talk like that about our family." For the rest of the day, everyone ignored the truth, excusing or outright denying his behavior. I never went back after that. I want nothing to do with people who protect someone like him. Story 21. I had great aunts who never married and lived together their whole adult lives. They were overbearing and too involved in my granddad's life, as he was their youngest brother. The second eldest was particularly argumentative, and the older she got, the worse it became. Memorable moments include her loudly singing "God Save the Queen" in the living room when she first met my Irish aunt, and slipping whiskey into everyone's tea or coffee, whether they wanted it or not. Most family stories from my mom's side came from her, and though she was the second eldest, she was the last to die. One of her stories was that my granddad had caused the death of his baby sister by dropping her when he was young. Supposedly, the eldest sister then went to post the obituary and was killed by a tram. After my aunt's death, when we were clearing out the house, we found records that proved the baby had actually died of whooping cough. She had let my granddad go to his grave believing he was responsible for his sister's death, and I cannot understand why. On top of that, the eldest sister had not died right after. It was a decade later. So my granddad knew the story was false, but let her continue to spread it. It makes me wonder how many other lies we believed. While cleaning, we also found photos of her with a group of women in what looked like military uniforms, but the armbands had been cut out of the pictures. Those were the only photos she had not burned, but we still have no idea what they meant. Story 22. When I was 31, I found out that my maternal grandmother, who practically raised me, had killed my grandfather. While researching my family tree, I wanted to learn about him since he died about 4 years before I was born. We never really talked about him, and I did not know how he had died. I discovered a 1978 article about his death, along with a police report from the same year listing my grandmother's arrest. At first, I did not connect the two, but once I did, I submitted a Freedom of Information Act request for the case file. It turned out that my grandfather had been in poor health, having suffered multiple strokes and needed a lot of care. Eventually, my grandmother grew exhausted and one day snapped, stabbing him repeatedly and killing him. She was arrested, tried, and found not guilty by reason of insanity. She spent time in an institution but was released in 1981, the year before I was born, and moved in with my family. She raised me from childhood, and to me she was always sweet and caring. Learning this shook me deeply. When I asked my dad about it, wondering how he could have left her alone with me as a child, his response was, "Oh, you didn't know that? Well, you turned out all right." Story 23. My boyfriend once told me a story about his grandmother's close friend, a man I will call John. He was kind and friendly, and my boyfriend even helped him by mowing his lawn and doing small chores because of his age. Then John unexpectedly took his own life. Afterward, my boyfriend, his grandmother, and John's children went through his house to clean it out and collect belongings. While sorting through things, they discovered stacks of magazines, specifically bondage and BDSM material. It was shocking because John had always seemed so innocent, and no one ever suspected that side of him. They also found several VHS tapes. At first, they thought they might be family home videos or recordings of his kids, but when they played one, it turned out to be adult bondage films. My boyfriend's grandmother, who was very old-fashioned and had never even cursed in her life, was stunned. She still cared for John and was heartbroken over his death, but she never looked at him the same way after that discovery. Story 24. My great-uncle was an amazing man. He was an oil man his whole life, working in the fields of Casper, Wyoming. A byproduct of working in these oil fields for 40 years meant that he inhaled oil nearly every working day of his life. In spite of the slowly progressive cancer filling his lungs, he lived a perpetually brilliant life, full of meaning and love for others. His daily routine was to drive around Casper, Wyoming, saying hi to all his friends, the people that knew and loved him, and giving away Susan B. Anthony quarters and Buckeyes to keep in their pockets to newly made friends along the way. This was his way of reminding people to be thankful and to pray every day when they felt the items in their pocket. I still remember watching the space station Mir go overhead at his house, just before it was supposed to burn up on re-entry. My great-uncle had many passions, but perhaps his greatest was a love for pre-communist Chinese Oriental furniture. He showed me and my sister that the way you can tell a piece of Oriental furniture is genuine is that it will have a secret compartment somewhere within it. He had 5 pieces of this furniture in his house, and my sister and I figured out where 4 of the secret compartments were, but we could never figure out the 5th. The day we went over to his house after he died, I found the 5th secret compartment. Inside it, I found a stack of nearly $10,000 in cash and a letter on National Hemlock Society letterhead. In the letter, he explained that he had been in pain for a long, long time, and that on his and his wife's last trip to Mexico, he had purchased a large quantity of nitroglycerin tablets and would be using them to stop his heart. In a house full of mourning people, I tried to get my mom's attention to the letter, but she shooed me away, so I went and pestered my father. Eventually, with annoyance, he listened to what I said. I whispered it in his ear because I didn't want to traumatize a house full of grieving people. I never knew if he told my great-uncle's son, now the CEO of a Fortune 500 construction company. This has forever changed the way that I feel about assisted suicide. My great-uncle was one of the happiest men I ever knew. He owned horses, and every morning he would open his window and neigh at them. They would call back, and that's how he knew they were okay, and it was all right for him to get up and start his day. I just have such a hard time reconciling that a man with such a tangible love of life would leave it behind and not tell anyone. Story 25. My aunt was a serious substance addict who did many terrible things as a result. All my life, my cousins lived with us in foster care. The oldest of the two lived with us off and on, and the younger one is now my adopted brother. He is 11. Throughout my life, my aunt was always the subject of disgust at family gatherings like Thanksgiving or Christmas. Her mistakes were treated like a spectacle, and I think it made others feel better about themselves to highlight her issues. Nearly 2 years ago in September, she passed away in a shelter from an overdose. I cannot even begin to explain how much I have learned about my family because of this. My mom and my little brother took it the hardest, of course. What made it even worse was that no one was really surprised, and that hurt in its own way. The disturbing part is what I learned afterward. She had been a comedian, an artist, and someone who had saved as many lives as she had damaged. Yet while she was alive, no one in the family ever said anything nice about her or to her face. I truly believe that with the right environment and support system, people can recover even from the worst addictions. But she was never given that chance. From a young age, I grew up thinking of her as monstrous, when in reality she was just a human being in pain, reacting the only way she knew how, probably believing that no one would have cared whether she was doing good or not. It is disturbing that my family painted her in such a dark way, when in truth she was someone who needed help and compassion. Maybe unrelated, but after her death, her daughter received her possessions. Her purse mysteriously went missing, but her phone was among the items returned. Story 26. Growing up, my dad used to tell me stories about his childhood, especially about how my granddad would discipline him and his siblings. He always told them like funny stories, never showing anger or resentment, because that was just how it was back then. It wasn't until my granddad died 14 years ago that my maternal grandmother told me how truly awful things had been, and it was abuse on a level I hadn't realized. My grandfather used to beat his children with bramble cuttings and then make them sit in saltwater baths afterward. He regularly beat and emotionally tormented his wife, which many in the family believe contributed to her death when she was in her early 50s. He encouraged his children and his wife to steal for him, but if they were caught, he would pretend he had nothing to do with it. He also knew that one of his sons was harming his own sisters, but chose to ignore it. Only a few years ago, my dad finally told me that my grandfather had made him steal kegs of beer from a local pub. One night, he was caught, and my grandfather denied any involvement, leaving my dad to take the blame. He ended up spending 6 months in a borstal. That was the only time I saw my dad show real anger toward his father, for throwing him under the bus. When he was released, only his mother came to meet him at the train station. Back at home, his father was waiting for him with a belt. After my grandmother told me all of this, I found it impossible to grieve for him or to feel any affection again. I had always known my maternal grandmother hated him, but I never fully understood why until then. Even now, many of his children still put him on a pedestal. I still cannot process why, but I suppose that is just one of the complexities of being human. Story 27. My grandfather, my dad's father, was a terrible person. When I was just a baby, my parents and my dad's family had a falling out over what times my grandparents could look after each grandchild. My grandparents always gave endless time and attention to my older cousin, even though his mom didn't work and his dad barely did. Meanwhile, my parents were two self-made business owners with little time, and I was already in the local nursery every day. At a family party, my mom brought this up, and my grandfather got so enraged that he threatened to kill her and made physical threats toward her in front of the whole family, while she was holding me as a baby. My dad had to hold him back, and after that, they cut ties with my dad's family for a while. He never apologized. My mom told me that in that moment she covered one of my ears with her hand and pressed my head against her chest to cover the other, hoping I would never remember it, and I didn't. I sometimes wonder what I would have done to my grandfather if I had known the truth while he was still alive. I think that is why my mom never told me earlier. In the end, it was one of many reasons I distanced myself from my dad's family. It seems most of them took after my grandfather, because to this day they are all terrible people. Story 28. My great-uncle passed away, and everyone was devastated, especially my dad. He carried guilt for it, but I couldn't understand why at first. My great-uncle died in his 50s. The truth was that he and my other great-uncle, both of whom I had loved since childhood, were attacked in one of their homes by a gang. The uncle who died was shot in the heart. The one who survived barely did, because he was repeatedly struck in the back of the head with the claw of a hammer. They had been raided by the gang because of substances. That was the day I learned that my entire family on my father's side was involved in the substance trade. I was only 10 years old when I found that out. My dad felt guilty because he had known something like that might happen one day. He had given my great-uncle a gun to protect himself, but the one night he took the gun home with him was the night of the attack. He blamed himself for it. That experience taught me an unforgettable lesson. Do not get tangled up in substances because it destroys lives. It hurts to know that I will never see my great-uncle again because of that world. Story 29. I found out that my grandfather was not my mother's real father only after he took his own life. He had fallen into deep depression after my grandmother passed. She was the love of his life, and they had shared what seemed like a perfect marriage. He adored her, and he adored my mother too. He was a man who had so much love to give, but he always carried a quiet heaviness inside. He hanged himself, and it was my mother and me who found him. What no one else knows is that there was a suicide note. I found it, skimmed it, and nearly froze in shock. I hid it. In the note, he confessed that he was not my mother's biological father. He wrote that he had always known, but had never told anyone, not even my grandmother. He kept it to himself to avoid causing pain. He believed her real father was most likely their landlord, a man who frequently came to their house to collect rent. He had found out he was sterile 3 days before my grandmother told him she was pregnant, but he chose silence, never wanting my mother or grandmother to face judgment. What pushed him over the edge was not just the grief after my grandmother's death, but something he overheard. Less than a year after she passed, he visited my mother almost every day. One day he overheard her telling her aunt over the phone that it was becoming difficult having him around all the time. I know she did not mean it harshly, but he interpreted it as rejection. Already in a fragile state, it drove him to despair. In the note, he wrote that if she thought he was a burden, she should know the truth, that she was not his biological daughter, and that everyone would be better off without him. I know it was his depression speaking, not the man he truly was. My mother does not know any of this, and she is a good person. The truth would destroy her. It breaks my heart to carry this secret, but I will never forget the man he was, someone who loved deeply, who sacrificed his own truth to protect the people he cherished. Story 30. When my biological father passed in 2006, he and I had only just begun reconnecting a few years earlier. During school breaks and summer vacations, I guess it was easy for him to pretend to be a good guy for a week at a time. After his death, when I was cleaning out his house, I found an entire garage stacked shoulder high with empty beer cans and whiskey bottles. There were packets of coca hidden in nearly every room of the house, and photographs of women who had been having affairs with him. The most disturbing discovery was a desktop computer hidden in the back of a closet, completely full of child exploitation material. I immediately called the police and left the house until they cleared everything suspicious out. On a more positive note, that computer ended up helping the police bust an entire trafficking ring. My father turned out to be an awful person, but I often wonder what drove him to that life. I cannot defend him, but he must have been struggling with serious mental issues I never would have guessed. 4 years after he died, I was contacted by the estate attorney who told me I had a brother just a year younger than I am. We never talk about our biological father, but we have grown very close. Story 31. My dad took his own life in December 2010. Afterward, I struggled badly with substances and mental health problems. He left behind a very long letter before he died, one I still have not read and do not feel ready to read yet. Maybe one day. Around 2012, while talking with my mom about my dad, she suddenly asked me if I had ever been abused. The question shocked me, and I asked why she would bring that up. She explained that when my dad was very young, he had been abused by one of his older brother's friends. She told me that was the reason he turned to substances and why he had battled depression throughout his life. She said she had asked me because she had always been trying to understand the root of my struggles with addiction and mental health. I also learned that my dad had a favorite park he loved to take us to as a family, about an hour away. It was a beautiful place, and I still love it there. But my mom revealed that the real reason he liked going was because the man who had harmed him lived nearby. My dad wanted to catch him outside one day, alone, and hurt him, though he never did, at least as far as I know. Story 32. Here's a bit of a lighter one. My brother died in a car accident when he was 16. After his funeral, my mom shut the door to his bedroom, and no one could bring themselves to pack up his belongings. About a year later, my dad decided it was time to clean out the room, donate some things, and decide what to keep. He asked me and our oldest brother to do it because my parents just couldn't. I had been going into the room throughout the year, dusting, vacuuming, sometimes watching TV on his bed, and not going to lie, even talking to him in there. So I felt okay with it. We got started, but it was a slow process since we kept stopping to look at everything and talk. When we got to the closet, my brother began pulling down books, and suddenly he burst out laughing and crying at the same time. Hidden behind the books was a stash of Playboy magazines that our younger brother had been stealing from him. It wasn't some massive revelation, but it was funny because our brother had always been shy and quiet, not the kind to sneak around and steal. When the magazines first went missing, our older brother assumed it had been his rowdy friends. Finding them provided just the kind of comic relief we needed in that heavy moment. Story 33. My ex died a year ago very suddenly. People could not give me many details other than he broke his leg 2 weeks ago and died at the doctor's office during a visit. No one seemed to know how he had even broken his leg. The next night, I learned from his landlord's father, who lived upstairs from his basement apartment, that he had still been drinking heavily right up until his death. For the past year, he had been trying to convince me he was sober so that I would take him back. I also found out that he had been unfaithful to his new girlfriend constantly, unable to remain loyal, and that it had led to a drunken physical fight between them one night. That was how he broke his leg. 2 weeks later, he had a stroke and died. I am fairly certain he had been drinking while on blood thinners for his leg injury, but since I cut everyone connected to him out of my life a couple of weeks after he died, I will probably never know the full results of the medical investigation. I already knew he was an alcoholic and a cheater, but what still hurts is realizing he lied to me for over a year about becoming a better person in order to get me back, when in reality he was only getting worse. Story 34. My coworker recently passed away from cancer. He was a kind man, married to a loving wife for about 25 years. During the last 5 years of his life, he fought several forms of cancer, and she stood by him, driving him to chemotherapy, quitting her job to care for him, and doing everything she could to make him comfortable. After he died, it became my responsibility to go through his work computer to gather relevant files and information so that I could absorb his duties before the computer was wiped and reassigned. While doing this, I discovered gigabytes of explicit content, much of it downloaded from the internet, but some appeared to be personally filmed. There was also a briefcase filled with DVDs labeled with his name and another person's initials, along with dates. I did not view them. In addition, there were Word documents containing Amazon wish lists with links to toys and bondage equipment. Finally, I found paperwork for a $150,000 life insurance policy payable to a man who was not a family member and whose initials matched those on the DVDs. A couple of weeks after his death, his wife asked me if I thought he might have been having an affair. She had received a letter from the insurance company addressed to her house, explaining how to collect the benefits, but she had never known about the policy or the beneficiary. The company refused to disclose further details to her. I denied knowing anything. From what I could tell, my co-worker had been in a long-term secret relationship with another man. And as far as I know, I am the only person outside of that relationship who is aware of it. Story 35. My father passed away in 2005 when I was 36. That was when I discovered that he had a secret second family with 3 children, a boy and 2 girls just like mine, whose ages were very close to ours. My half-brother was 38, and my half-sisters were 35 and 29. I grew up thinking we were poor. We lived in a rundown apartment in a bad part of town, always ate the cheapest food from the grocery store, and wore clothes from donation boxes. But it turns out my father was spending far more money on his secret family than on us. To make matters worse, this family, who did not even share his last name, ended up receiving more from his estate than my sisters and I did in his will. The only small consolation I take is that I was able to grow my small inheritance while all three of them are now broke. To add a lighter note, I'll recall something that happened this past Christmas. At a gathering of extended family, most of whom I only see once a decade or so, a group of relatives were confronting their stepmom about her now deceased husband's philandering, which had been exposed after his death. She quickly shut them down by saying, "We weren't cheating on each other, we were swingers." I was not the only one who laughed out loud. Story 36. My grandma died when I was a toddler, and it was only after my grandpa passed away that my mom began opening up about her childhood with them. In public, they were church-going, respectable people, but in private, they were cruel. The worst story I ever heard still haunts me. When my mom was young, there was a boy in the neighborhood, whom I will call Michael, who often came over to play with her and her siblings. One day, after yelling at the kids for something, my grandma took Michael, along with my mom and her siblings, into the basement. There, she slit Michael's throat in front of them and threatened to do the same to them if they ever spoke about it. With years of prior abuse from both parents, the children were too terrified to say anything. My mom remembered being taken in the car while my grandpa and a couple of men buried the body. Years later, after my mom got married, my dad encouraged her to go to therapy. It was there that she finally spoke about what had happened and reported it to the police. She even showed them the spot where she remembered the body being buried, but nothing was ever found. It still troubles me deeply to know that I am related to people capable of such things. I do not remember my grandmother, but I do remember my grandfather. He always gave me the creeps, and now that I know these stories, I understand why. Story 37. A close friend of mine ended his life about 8 years ago. I always knew he had a rough life, but only recently did I learn the true extent of what he went through. His younger brother told me about their childhood. When their mother would leave, she sometimes called her older brother to watch over the boys, even though she knew what he would do to them. They were abused from a very young age. At first, they were manipulated into thinking it was normal, forced into things no child should ever face, and threatened into silence as they grew older. The man convinced them that they would only be safe with him and that if they ever told anyone, he would kill their mother. For years this went on. When they were older, the abuse escalated into even worse violations. This continued during the time I was friends with them, but I never knew. Eventually, the two brothers moved across the country together, cutting off in-person contact with most friends, including me. I never understood why until I heard the full story. What ultimately broke my friend came years later. Somehow, their uncle found out where they lived and broke into their apartment. He intended to hurt them again, but only my friend was home. It was the first time in about a year that he was attacked, and it was too much for him. The next morning, his younger brother returned from a night out and found him in the bath. Wrists cut, gone. I had always known they were afraid, but I never understood how deep their pain went. I regret not asking more questions, not digging deeper into why they carried so much fear. Maybe things could have turned out differently if I had. Story 38. One of my uncles assaulted one of my cousins when she was very young, still in single digits. The truth was hidden for years by the child, the uncle, and even his wife, my aunt. They never told her father, who was the uncle's own brother. Every year we held Easter celebrations at their house with egg hunts, candy, and a little reunion. But one year in my cousin's 20s, the truth came out. Her father became so distraught upon learning what had happened that he had a heart attack from the shock. Another cousin, her brother, took it especially hard. I did not know any of this at the time. I only learned the full story years later, after the uncle who caused it all had died. The cousin who had lost his father spiraled into self-destruction. He turned to substances, and when he couldn't get them, he would inhale gasoline fumes to get high. He spent time in and out of jail. Most of the family won't talk about it, but I heard that at one point he either killed someone or came close. The story I was told is that someone tried to steal a radio from his car, and he struck the man in the back of the head with a pipe. The victim ended up in the hospital, and they weren't sure if he would survive. That cousin and I used to be very close when we were growing up. Now I haven't seen him in more than 20 years. Story 39. When my grandfather was dying, he pulled my mother aside and told her a secret he had kept his entire life. He revealed that his uncle had been a notorious bank robber in Ontario, Canada, in the early 1900s. He would rob a bank, get caught, be sent to jail, and then escape. This happened several times before he finally moved out west to Alberta, where he robbed another bank and was arrested again. Because of his record and repeated escapes, he was placed in a maximum security prison. You would think that would have been the end of his story, but it wasn't. He escaped from maximum security. For 10 years, no one saw him, and everyone assumed he had vanished far away. Then one day, he was spotted in a town not far from the prison and captured for the last time. How did he manage to evade capture for so long? Apparently, during one of his escapes, he met a woman in the nearby town, fell in love, and started a family on a farm. To work on the farm without drawing attention, he disguised himself in his wife's clothing whenever he went outside. For 10 years, the police never figured it out. Eventually, they did, though my grandfather never said how. When he confessed this story, my grandfather admitted he had carried it as a heavy burden all his life, believing it had been a source of shame for his parents. But my mother reassured him that it wasn't shameful at all. It was an extraordinary and fascinating piece of family history. We all told him how glad we were to know about it, and I think he was relieved to finally share it and realize we weren't horrified, but entertained. Story 40. My aunt decided to do one of those ancestry DNA tests, and the results showed a new connection. You have a cousin. She thought nothing of it at first, since she has plenty of cousins, but then a profile popped up for a man she didn't know, who was older than all of her cousins. He reached out and explained that he had been adopted as a baby, his mother had requested a closed adoption, and he had joined the site in hopes of finding his biological parents. The problem was that all of my aunt's uncles and aunts had passed away recently. His birth date was before any of them had married, which raised serious questions. Did one of the aunts secretly give birth and put the child up for adoption? Did an uncle father a child as a teenager? The only way to know for sure would have been for their children to take DNA tests. Instead of handling it delicately, my aunt printed his profile, brought it to our family reunion, and in front of everyone told the children, who were still mourning their parents and one brother, that they had a secret sibling and that one of their parents must have had a child out of wedlock. The worst part was the way she did it. Smug, almost gloating, like she was proud to have uncovered the family's dirty little secret. It was as if she saw herself as Sherlock Holmes exposing some scandal. It was cruel and unnecessary, and I lost all respect for her that day. Since then, I've refused to use those ancestry sites myself. Story 41. After my grandpa suddenly passed away, I was given a hat box with some of the belongings he wanted me to have. He always considered me his favorite grandchild because I shared his love of the outdoors, and to me, he was my hero. Inside the box was his pocket knife and his diary from his time in the Indian Army and the years after his discharge, when he worked as a writer and engineer. Reading his diary was heartbreaking. Entry by entry, I watched his depression grow deeper, his untreated PTSD eating away at him. It was devastating to realize that his death had been connected to the struggle. He had stopped taking his medication because of his depression, and in a country like India where mental health care is inadequate, it had been a recipe for disaster. The most disturbing part of the diary was the final entry. It simply read, "I feel like a dark cloud is always hanging over me. It's straining my relationship with my wife and kids. What's wrong with me?" And then there was nothing more. That single unfinished note has stayed with me ever since. I still keep the hat box with his knife and diary, and his story has become my inspiration to pursue medical school and become a psychiatrist. I want to help others get the kind of care my grandfather never received. Story 42. I always knew my dad had a rough upbringing, but one time when he was working away, my mom opened up to me about just how bad it really was. She told me that his mother, and I refuse to call that woman my grandmother, would regularly beat him, soak his bed with water so he couldn't sleep, and generally make his life miserable. She was an alcoholic, and suddenly everything I had ever felt about her made sense. His father wasn't much better, an ex-national service type who acted like a drill sergeant, measuring his hair and controlling everything. They cut contact with us when I was about 5, so I only barely remembered them. But even then, I knew I didn't like them. When they eventually died and we went to their funerals, I couldn't help but laugh under my breath when they read out my sisters and my names during the eulogy as people who were most affected by their deaths. Really? After treating my dad like garbage and cutting us off completely when I was little? The hypocrisy was almost unbelievable. I wasn't very close with my dad when I was growing up, but as I got older, I realized he is one of the best humans I've ever known. Despite everything he went through, all he has ever done is work hard and look after me, my sisters, and my mum the best he could. In a strange way, I guess I should thank his parents, because by being so cruel to him, they made it that much clearer to me how truly awesome my dad is. Story 43. My stepfather was a man that everybody loved. He was intelligent, funny, and someone I deeply admired. When I was little, I had heard whispers that he'd had problems with substances when he was younger, but everyone believed that was long behind him. Years later, he was diagnosed with terminal cancer. Before his death, he sent an email to my mother entitled "Sorry," with a detailed list of all the unpaid loans he had taken out over the years. It added up to nearly 300,000 euros. None of us ever knew what he had done with the money. We had always struggled financially, with no vacations, no luxuries, no extras, so clearly it wasn't spent on us. At his funeral, his estranged brother, who had been a lifelong addict, suddenly showed up. We had not seen him in years, but he revealed that he had been in contact with my stepfather recently. That should have been the clue we needed. But it wasn't until we later found substance paraphernalia while cleaning out the house that the truth fully sank in. He hadn't just relapsed. He had been using for years and secretly funding substances for both himself and his brother. The fallout from that discovery nearly destroyed us. He left behind mountains of debt and devastation, and he wasn't alive to face what we went through. I still resent him for that, but my mother somehow managed to pull us out of the wreckage. She gave my sisters a full education, even university, and held our family together through it all. To me, she is my hero, my superhero, and I can only hope to grow into even half the person she is. Story 44. The friend I was once in love with asked me to pick up his laptops, wipe the data, and send them to his family. A few days earlier, he had told me I was the person closest to his heart, and that he wished we could fly together someday, holding each other. He said he had some trips coming up and didn't have time to sort through the laptops himself. It was close to Christmas, so I assumed he was going on vacation. Instead, he hanged himself in a car park at work, in a quiet corner where nobody usually went. We only found out after several days when he didn't answer my calls, and coworkers noticed his car sitting there. A tradesman eventually went to that corner to do some repairs and found him. When I went through his data, I realized he had been planning his death for years. He had a will that he updated every few months, and in the week before his death, his browser history showed searches about depression and the quickest, least painful ways to die. I also found things about his personal life I hadn't known. He had slept with many men, was into kinks, wrote erotica, and kept a large collection of explicit photos and videos. His journals revealed a broken childhood, a fractured relationship with his father, and layers of pain he carried his entire life. This was the man I had once loved so deeply. It was heartbreaking to discover who he truly was underneath, and to realize just how much suffering he had been hiding all along. Story 45. In 2017, my very dear online friend passed away from a terminal illness. I'll call him Lucian. He had a sister I was close to while he was alive, though after his passing, we drifted apart, which I completely understood. Lucian was an unusual and fascinating person. He had OCD, autism, and I'm fairly sure depression as well. He was bullied severely, often received death threats in school, and his family life was complicated. About a year after his death, his sister reached out to me. She revealed that she wasn't his sister at all, but his caretaker. Lucian had suffered from extreme schizophrenia. He hallucinated what he called the crazy circus directors, figures who followed him around and pressured him into harmful behavior. She told me that during one of his episodes, he had dislocated her shoulder and that he frequently ran away from home. At one point, he nearly jumped from a cliff because of what the hallucinations were telling him. His family had even been making plans to move to a larger city with better surveillance, hoping that constant monitoring might help keep him safe. Learning this didn't change how I felt about him at all. If anything, it deepened my love and sympathy for him. Lucian was a troubled soul who carried immense pain, but he was also kind and brilliant in his own way. I still miss him with my whole heart, and it breaks me to know that his life ended so young, at just 16.